"It is not so much the fire, sir," said Mr. Bingley of the Abbey Farm to Egremont, "but the temper of the people that alarms me. Do you know, sir, there were 2 or 3 score of them here, and, except my own farm servants, not one of them would lend a helping hand to put out the flames, though, with water so near, they might have been of great service." "You told my brother, Lord Marney, this?" "Oh, it's Mr. Charles I'm speaking to. My service to you, sir. I'm glad to see you in these parts again. It's a long time that we have had that pleasure, sir." "Traveling in foreign parts, as I have heard say?" "Something of that, but very glad to find myself at home once more, Mr. Bingley, though very sorry to have such a welcome as a blazing rick at the Abbey Farm." "Well, do you know, Mr. Charles, between ourselves," and Mr. Bingley lowered his tone, and looked around him, "things is very bad here. I can't make out, for my part, what has become of the country. 'Tain't the same land to live in as it was when you used to come to our moor coursing, with the old lord. You remember that, I be sure, Mr. Charles?" "'Tis not easy to forget good sport, Mr. Bingley. With your permission, I will put my horse up here for half an hour. I have a fancy to stroll to the ruins." "You want to find them much changed," said the farmer, smiling. "They have seen a deal of different things in their time. But you will taste our ale, Mr. Charles?" "When I return." But the hospitable Bingley would take no denial, and as his companion waved on the present occasion entering his house, for the sun had been some time declining, the farmer, calling one of his labourers to take Egremont's horse, hastened into the house to fill the brimming cup. "And what do you think of this fire?" said Egremont to the hind. "I think 'tis hard times for the poor, sir." "But rick burning will not make the times easier, my good man." The man made no reply, but with a dogged look led away the horse to his stable. About half a mile from Marney, the dale narrowed, and the river took a winding course. It ran through meads, soft and vivid with luxuriant vegetation, bounded on either side by rich hanging woods, save where occasionally a quarry broke the verdant bosom of the heights with its rugged and tawny form. Fair stone and plenteous timber, and the current of fresh waters, combined, with the silent and secluded scene screened from every harsh and angry wind, to form the sacred spot that in old days Holy Church loved to hallow with its beauteous and enduring structures. Even the stranger therefore, when he had left the town about 2 miles behind him, and had heard the farm and mill which he had since passed, called the Abbey Farm and the Abbey Mill, might have been prepared for the grateful vision of some monastic remains. As for Egremont, he had been almost born amid the ruins of Marney Abbey. Its solemn relics were associated with his first and freshest fancies. Every footstep was as familiar to him as it could have been to one of the old monks, yet never without emotion could he behold these unrivaled remains of one of the greatest of the great religious houses of the North. Over a space of not less than 10 acres might still be observed the fragments of the great abbey. These were, towards their limit, in general moss-grown and mouldering memorials that told where once rose the offices and spread the terraced gardens of the old proprietors. Here might still be traced the dwelling of the Lord Abbot, and there, still more distinctly, because built on a greater scale and of materials still more intended for perpetuity, the capacious hospital, a name that did not then denote the dwelling of disease, but a place where all the rites of hospitality were practiced, where the traveler from the proud baron to the lonely pilgrim asked the shelter and the succor that never were denied, and at whose gate, called the portal of the poor, the peasants on the abbey lands, if in want, might appeal each morn and night for raiment and for food. But it was in the center of this tract of ruins, occupying a space of not less than 2 acres, that, with a strength that had defied time, and with a beauty that had at last turned away the wrath of man, still rose, if not in perfect, yet admirable, form and state, one of the noblest achievements of Christian art, the Abbey Church. The summer vault was now its only roof, and all that remained of its gorgeous windows was the vastness of their arched symmetry, and some wreathed relics of their fantastic framework, but the rest was uninjured. From the west window, looking over the transept chapel of the Virgin, still adorned with pillars of marble and alabaster, the eye wandered down the nave to the great orient light, a length of nearly 300 feet, through a gorgeous avenue of unshaken walls and columns that clustered to the skies, on each side of the Ladies' Chapel rose a tower. One which was of great antiquity, being of that style which is commonly called Norman, short and very thick and square, did not mount much above the height of the western front, but the other tower was of a character very different. It was tall and light, and of a Gothic style most pure and graceful, the stone of which it was built, of a bright and even sparkling color, and looking as if it were hewn but yesterday. At first, its tide crest seemed injured, but the truth is, it was unfinished. The workmen were busied on this very tower the day that old Baldwin Greymount came as the king's commissioner to inquire into the conduct of this religious house. The abbots loved to memorize their reigns by some public work, which should add to the beauty of their buildings or the convenience of their subjects, and the last of the ecclesiastical lords of Marney, a man of fine taste and a skilful architect, was raising this new belfry for his brethren when the stern decree arrived that the bell should no more sound. And the hymn was no more to be chanted in the Ladies' Chapel, and the candles were no more to be lit on the high altar, and the gate of the poor was to be closed forever, and the wanderer was no more to find a home. The body of the church was in many parts overgrown with brambles and in all covered with a rank vegetation. It had been a very sultry day, and the blaze of the meridian heat still inflamed the air. The kind for shelter, rather than for sustenance, had wandered through some broken arches, and were lying in the shadow of the nave. This desecration of a spot, once sacred, still beautiful and solemn, jarred on the feelings of Egremont. He sighed and turning away, followed a path that after a few paces led him into the cloister garden. This was a considerable quadrangle, once surrounding the garden of the monks, but all that remained of that fair pleasaunce was a solitary yew in its center, that seemed the oldest tree that could well live, and was, according to tradition, more ancient than the most venerable walls of the abbey. Round this quadrangle was the refectory, the library, and the kitchen, and above them the cells and dormitory of the brethren. An imperfect staircase, not without danger, led to these unroofed chambers, but Egremont, familiar with the way, did not hesitate to pursue it, so that he soon found himself on an elevation overlooking the garden, while further on extended the vast cloisters of the monks, and adjoining was a cemetery, that had once been enclosed, and communicated with the cloister garden. It was one of those summer days that are so still, that they seem as it were a holiday of nature. The weary wind was sleeping in some grateful cavern, and the sunbeams basking on some fervent knoll. The river floated with a drowsy unconscious course. There was no wave in the grass, no stir in the branches. A silence so profound amid these solemn ruins offered the perfection of solitude, and there was that stirring in the mind of Egremont which rendered him far from indisposed for this loneliness. The slight words that he had exchanged with the farmer and the hind had left him musing. Why was England not the same land as in the days of his light-hearted youth? Why were these hard times for the poor? He stood among the ruins that, as the farmer had well observed, had seen many changes of creeds, of dynasties, of laws, of manners. New orders of men had arisen in the country, new sources of wealth had opened, new dispositions of power to which that wealth had necessarily led. His own house, his own order, had established themselves on the ruins of that great body, the emblems of whose ancient magnificence and strength surrounded him. And now his order was in turn menaced. And the people, the millions of toil, on whose unconscious energies during these changeful centuries all rested, what changes had these centuries brought to them? Had their advance in the national scale borne a due relation to that progress of their rulers, which had accumulated in the treasuries of a limited class the riches of the world, and made their possessors boast that they were the first of nations, the most powerful and the most free, the most enlightened, the most moral, and the most religious? Were there any rick burners in the times of the Lord Abbots? And if not, why not? And why should the stacks of the Earls of Marney be destroyed, and those of the Abbots of Marney spared? Brooding over these suggestions, some voices disturbed him, and looking round, he observed in the cemetery two men. One was standing beside a tomb which his companion was apparently examining. The first was of lofty stature, and though dressed with simplicity, had nothing sordid in his appearance. His garments gave no clue to his position in life. They might have been worn by a squire or by his gamekeeper, a dark velveteen dress and leathern gaiters. As Egremont caught his form, he threw his broad-brimmed country hat upon the ground and showed a frank and manly countenance. His complexion might in youth have been ruddy, but time and time's attendance, thought and passion, had paled it. His chestnut hair, faded, but not grey, still clustered over a noble brow. His features were regular and handsome, a well-formed nose, the square mouth and its white teeth, and the clear grey eye which befitted such an idiosyncrasy. His time of vigorous manhood, for he was much nearer 40 than 50 years of age, perhaps better suited his athletic form than the more supple and graceful season of youth. Stretching his powerful arms in the air, and delivering himself of an exclamation which denoted his weariness, and which had broken the silence, he expressed to his companion his determination to rest himself under the shade of the yew in the contiguous garden, and inviting his friend to follow him, he took up his hat and moved away. There was something in the appearance of the stranger that interested Egremont, and waiting till he had established himself in his pleasant resting place, Egremont descended into the cloister garden and determined to address him.